For those who are confused, we read the Passion Gospel at the end of the service here. The events of Palm Sunday take us from the location where Jesus' entire ministry has taken place, the region of Galilee, which was the northernmost region of ancient Palestine, to Judea, the southernmost region of ancient Palestine, and to its capital city, Jerusalem, which was the seat of Roman imperial power over Palestine. As we enter into Holy Week, it can be helpful to understand how Jesus' actions on what we now call Palm Sunday, according to Bible scholar Warren Carter, both mimic Roman imperial practices and redeploy and realign them, rejecting Roman claims to world domination and imagining the establishment of God's rule. In the opening act of Palm Sunday, we find Jesus instructing his disciples to procure a donkey for him to ride into Jerusalem. This moment has always been a little uncomfortable for me. Presumably, this donkey belonged to somebody, but the disciples simply go ahead and take the donkey. In one gospel, they do promise that the donkey will be returned, but the text doesn't ultimately show this happening. And while the donkey becomes something of a prop in a much larger drama, still the fate of the donkey matters. And to my childhood ears, this Palm Sunday episode always sounded quite a bit like stealing. And I knew that stealing wasn't allowed. So how should we understand this paradigmatic Palm Sunday episode? Well, let's begin by looking beyond the boundaries of this morning's assigned gospel text to better understand what is going on. Matthew's version of the narrative quotes the prophet Zechariah as saying, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." While Matthew's quotation of Zechariah stops there, many of Matthew's hearers would have been familiar with Zechariah's whole prophecy, which continues like this. "Your king will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem. And the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth." Mark doesn't quote Zechariah in his Palm Sunday narrative, but Mark likewise invokes notions of kingship, putting this acclamation on the mouths of the crowd. "Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." The gospel accounts of Palm Sunday then all identify Jesus as a king in one way or another. And we're so accustomed to hearing this language that we barely notice it, but the Romans who ruled Palestine would certainly have noticed it. As Bible scholar Warren Carter notes, the only kings that Rome recognized as legitimate were those appointed by Rome. And Rome viewed self-appointed kings and those acclaimed to be kings by popular support to be guilty of sedition. Jesus claiming a donkey, albeit with a promise of return in Matthew's gospel then, is a way of mimicking the practices of Roman leaders. Carter notes that forced procurement of someone else's property imitates the imperial practice of anagoria, whereby Roman officials, such as governors or military figures, requisition, transport, labor, supplies, and lodging from subject peoples. Indeed, Carter continues, imperial figures could demand shelter, bed, foods, fodder, without any kind of payment, which would have imposed considerable burdens on local communities and stoked their resentment of Roman rule. Jesus taking a donkey, then, is in some ways an analog to the Roman practice of anagoria. But in comparison to the Romans, of course, Jesus takes only one animal, and in Mark's gospel, the donkey's return is promised. But nevertheless, taking an animal belonging to another person is a symbolic way of designating oneself as mighty and powerful, of claiming the same rights and privileges as the Romans. In my imagination, however, the early hearers of the Gospels would not have seen Jesus' action as exploitative, but rather as a way of subverting the Roman practice of anagoria by using it so minimalistically. Jesus took only one animal. He didn't requisition a whole herd of donkeys. He didn't massively disrupt people's lives or demand outlays of their resources. This king borrows one donkey and promises its return. This then is a very different kind of king, a better kind of king. After Jesus procures the donkey, then, his next act of imperial imitation is to mimic the ritual of welcome that high-ranking Roman officials would have expected when they entered a new city. In this ritual, according to Carter, crowds would have received the distinguished person, often greeting them outside the city walls and then escorting them into the city. The city's leading officials and elites would then offer greetings and welcoming speeches. And finally, the dignitary would then visit the local temple and engage in worship and sacrifice, followed by a celebratory welcome feast. Carter notes that these welcoming and honoring rituals were both disruptive and expensive for local communities, and yet neglect of these rituals could bring severe consequences. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem was much simpler than what visiting imperial dignitaries would have expected. Indeed, Jesus undermines imperial practice yet again by radical simplification designed not to tax the common people. Through this simplification, Jesus is implicitly critiquing Roman imperial practices and the ways in which those practices exploited the people of Palestine. Jesus' entry also differs in another significant way from the Roman prototype. Rather than going to the temple to make a sacrifice, Jesus instead goes to the temple in Jerusalem and temporarily disrupts temple operations by driving out those who were buying and selling and those who were changing money. Indeed, under Roman rule, the Jerusalem temple had become a complex place in the life of the Jewish people. Under Roman occupation, the imperial governor had claimed the power to appoint the temple's chief priests. The priests then operated in an ambivalent space between faithfulness to their own people and traditions and accommodation to imperial priorities and interests. Indeed, twice every day, the priests were required to offer sacrifices on behalf of the Roman emperor. Such sacrifices were considered problematic, even heretical, in the minds of the average Jewish person. Jesus' critique of the temple thus centered on the collusion of the temple leadership with Rome. Indeed, after driving out the money changers and those who were buying and selling, Jesus was immediately approached by people experiencing blindness and lameness who were seeking healing. Jesus' final healings then focused on victims of the injustices experienced by so many common people under Roman imperial rule. Carter argues that ailments like blindness and damage to the limbs tended to become prevalent in the ancient worlds in context of food insecurity, nutritional deficiency, back-breaking work, poverty, and stress. In restoring the health of the bodies of those whose bodies have been ravaged by the impacts of empire, then, Jesus' healings are a critique of empire and a critique of the priesthood that had sold out to Rome and had little to offer their own suffering people. Indeed, as the Gospel of Matthew relates, when the chief priests and the scribes saw the amazing things Jesus did and heard the children crying out in the temple and saying, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became angry. The priests and the scribes became angry enough to want to do something about this disruptor of their power and prestige. They became angry enough to want to do something about this pretend king with his paltry procession of ragtag followers. This pretend king and his spectacle of healing. Who did he think he was doing this on their turf, claiming access to God that was theirs and theirs alone? He was a threat to their power, leading his followers to question their authority, leading his followers to question Rome's authority. And none of them seemed particularly afraid of the consequences that this kind of questioning usually provoked. They were doing all of this in broad daylight, not operating under the cloak of night like most rebels or bandits. And this lack of fear was disconcerting, terrifying even. Who were these people? And why weren't they afraid? Something had to be done to make them afraid. to put them back in their place, to disperse and demoralize them. And that's when the whispers began. Let's crucify him. That'll show them he's no king and get them back to Galilee where they belong. Let's crucify him. Crucify him. Crucify him. And it would be so. Amen.